So we're going to talk about the form itself. One of the things that is fairly new this year, we have always had the option when we get into our 470, these were the options that we will be choosing for Category 1. We have always had the option of lease-lit fiber. In the past, that has been just a transport line of fiber, and this year in USAC definition, that is not just a transport line of fiber, it is also a bundled lit fiber service. So in the past, when you went on and you had fiber from your local provider, you have chosen internet access and transport bundled because that is what it has always been. It will not be that this year. So do not just automatically go in and choose what you chose last year, which I know that we're in the habit of doing. If it is given to you over fiber, it will be leased lit fiber, and we will make note of that down in the narrative that it is a bundled fiber service. If you have fiber that takes you back to Illinois Century Network, it will be leased lit fiber. Noted down in the bottom, this is fiber transport only, back to internet access ISP service only. If you choose this one or this one, and USAC thinks that you have fiber already, they will call you or send you an email and tell you they think you've chosen the wrong thing. So they are reaching out to point out to you that they think you've chosen the wrong thing. If you go in on your own and file and say transport bundled, you can do that. And it will say that. Oh, sorry, went to sleep. Get back out for you. I forgot that when I don't touch the machine itself, it will go to sleep on me. It's not a smart board. So if you are choosing that going through, please note that. We are going to have some discussion here in a minute on some of these other options. So for those of you who are trying to work through the USAC lingo, leased dark fiber and leased lit fiber is an option. So if you have dark fiber that you are wanting to light up, you have that as a choice. You also have self-provision networks, which are networks that you are owning and maintaining yourself. Meaning, if you are putting in fiber and you want to own it all yourself and you want to purchase the equipment to light that fiber up on the ends, like between your buildings, etc., you can absolutely bid and do that. Please keep in mind if it is self-provisioned that you are responsible for it. So if somebody comes in to build something on your network and they cut your fiber lines, you will have to fix those fiber lines, like they are yours. If you apply for dark fiber or self-provision networks, you also have to apply for leased lit fiber because you have to be able to show that it was more cost-effective in the long run than a traditional service that you would get from a provider. And that gets a little bit complicated, but I just wanted to point out that those options are all there, and we will talk about them here in a minute. If you need a brand new connection, you are at the end of your current contract is ending in June 30th of 2018, your contract is done and you need a brand new connection and you want all the available options to you, you would choose all of these various things. If you currently have a T3 line or a Metro E line that runs on copper, you want to include this internet access and transport bundled. Only if you currently have that. Because what's going to happen is we really want you to get fiber. We want to upgrade you to something that's scalable and will meet your needs now and later in time. But if you currently have a building that has a copper line, apply for that too, because we don't know when that fiber will get installed. So every provider could tell you, absolutely, I'm going to have that installed and ready for you by July 1st. If they don't, you can't continue to pay for your month-to-month bill. So let's make sure that we include both of them if you are switching from an old technology to a new technology. If you have a current lease-lit fiber line already, you don't have to include the internet access and transport bundled, okay? It gets a little complicated. This is if you want to go back to Illinois Century Network. There are active providers within the state who are looking to build out to ICN, who do not have the service themselves, but they are looking to build out to ICN. There are also active providers in the state who are looking to give you fiber and the internet access. So there are multiple options that you have here, and we can help you choose what's right for your district when we get through helping with the form. Again, if you choose lease-lit fiber, you have to make a note. What they really should have done is had lease-lit fiber bundled and lease-lit fiber transport. But since we don't have the two options, we do have to note that down in the notation of the form. And so I'm going to let Joe talk about the different options here and help us understand better what might be a good solution for you. And even those of you who are in contract, you might find an option here that you might like better than your current contract moving forward. So thanks,
Mindy.
Joe.
Mindy, you did a great job.
Oh, thanks.
Did a great job. So let me talk to you a little bit about my background. We chose not to do a background slide. And I'm actually a contractor with Education Superhighway. The most relevant background that I have to E-Rate is probably focused on the last 10 years. From 2007 to 2014, I was president and CEO of North Carolina's version of the Illinois Century Network. Now, we were different organized. In North Carolina, we were a private nonprofit. It's called MCNC, the Microelectronics Center of North Carolina. And the network that we owned and operated was called the North Carolina Research and Education Network. And it was a statewide backbone network that did more than education, similar to what ICN is evolving to. We were the upstream internet access network for all 115 public school districts in the state. In North Carolina, we're county-based school districts for the most part. We also served as the upstream network for all 58 community colleges, all the universities in the university system, as well as Duke and Wake Forest and most of the private colleges and universities. We had about 300 healthcare entities connected to the network, and also the judicial system and public safety in the state both used the network as their backbone. While I was CEO, we transitioned from leased lit service to make up those backbone circuits to building, owning, and operating our own fiber. We were the proud recipient of 2 broadband stimulus awards, about $104 million of federal funding. We went out and raised $40 million privately, and we built a 2,600-mile network. 1,800 miles was new build, 800 miles was lease. In 2014, I decided that I wanted to do something different, and I think it was probably best for MCNC too, because I'm more of a builder than I was a sustainer. The network was in place. We had all of these subscribers to the network, so that was great. And my wife and I formed our own company called Mighty River. For about the last year at MCNC, I had been traveling up to DC and meeting a lot with the then managing director of the FCC, a gentleman by the name of John Wilkins. And John had told me that they were really considering modernizing the E-Rate program. And one of the things that they wanted to do was that they wanted applicants to be able to procure in any way possible dark fiber. Okay, now when I say dark fiber, I mean fiber that the applicant has some ownership over and that the applicant is responsible for buying the equipment to provision that fiber. So basically it's a fiber-based service without a bandwidth cap, okay, without a bandwidth limit, that the applicant actually buys the equipment for and puts that fiber into service. So it's not like saying to a service provider, I want a 10 gig service between these 2 points, and the service provider comes with the equipment, they provision the circuit on it, and they manage that equipment for you, and if anything goes wrong, it's one throat to choke. Mindy just said this. Dark fiber can either be leased from a service provider, so a service provider owns the fiber cable, and then you lease a specific number of strands from that service provider, and then you provide the equipment as the applicant to put on each end. So in other words, you're treating this WAN circuit like you would your in-building LAN. You're providing the equipment, you provide the oversight for it, and it's your responsibility for that circuit. So that's one way, leasing dark fiber from a service provider for those that do it. Or the second option that the FCC wanted to explore was that applicants could actually bid to build their own fiber networks, their own fiber WANs, their own fiber upstream connections to a ICN POP or whatever. And then they were responsible for not just procuring the equipment to light the fiber or put it into service, but they were also responsible for if the fiber got cut, so actually for the maintenance and operation of the fiber itself, because they were the owner of it, the titled owner. So I helped with that. I helped actually write the last couple parts of the order from a technical perspective. There were a couple of offices within the FCC, the Policy and Strategy Office, and also in the Telecommunications Access and Policy Division, the E-rate division in there, where they were writing some of the stuff. I got a chance to look at the order beforehand and kind of talk about the technical things. And then when we decided to form our own company, USAC and the FCC became our first client. And for the last 3 years, up until June 30th, we worked with just about every applicant that was interested in one of these options. And in fact, any applicant that had special construction, which I'll talk about in a minute as a definition. So is that clear to everybody, though? The FCC wanted to give applicants the capability to deploy WAN infrastructure, basically fiber-based WAN infrastructure, so that you could grow with your academic needs and your instructional needs. They saw that bandwidth demand among K through 12 schools in particular, and also among libraries, was skyrocketing. And they knew that with bandwidth capped, least lit fiber services, that a lot of districts wouldn't be able to afford to continue to raise those caps and go with a fully managed service. So they wanted to give you an option to provision your own network. So that's kind of the foundation. Are there any questions?
So the advantage of having your least lit fiber, provisioning it yourself, or having the dark fiber, is that you yourself would own it and there wouldn't be that monthly reoccurring cost back to a provider?
The potential, Mindy, is that with a lease of dark fiber from the provider services, you may have that monthly recurring cost. There is a standard lease vehicle where if you're leasing 2 strands of fiber that the service provider owns between your 2 locations, there will be a monthly recurring cost in some cases for that dark fiber. It won't be as expensive as if that provider had to buy the equipment and provision it and provision a fixed bandwidth service. I think the real advantage is that most routers today that you're going to put on, or most switches, most terminating switches, are 1 gig and 10 gig capable. And that if you need during the school year to upgrade, let's say halfway through the school year, you go 1-to-1 at a high school, or you go BYOD at a high school, and you want to upgrade from 1 gig to 10 gig. If you own your own network and own your own equipment, that's a snap. That's a snap, because you've likely procured a switch that can provision both at 1 gig and 10 gig. If you have to wait for a provider to do that, first of all, you can't do it until the end of a year, and you had to have bid both 1 gig and 10 gig prices in your E-rate contract in order to make that upgrade at the end of the year. So what the FCC started to see, and what we got feedback from applicants, is when we started to look at their wide area network connections, there were, their instructional technology needs and their instructional needs didn't necessarily always fit nicely into an academic year. Things happened mid-year, and the applicants wanted the flexibility, more ownership, so that they could provision. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, I've worked with 2,000 applicants, 1,500 to 2,000 applicants over the last 3 years. There's a very small number of applicants who are confident enough in their IT staff that they can provision and manage their own networks. And I think that's one of the first things you have to think about before you take this path. Is, do I have the resources, the human resources, to do this with everything else on my plate? Do I have the WAN skills with everything else on my plate to do this? That's number one. And number two, are those staff resources sustainable for the future? Are they sustainable for the future? Because once I commit to doing this, once I commit to buying the equipment and provisioning it myself, that's a commitment. That's a commitment. So this slide is more about on the 470, and Mindy went through a little bit of this, on the FCC Form 470, what do I post for in order to have a compliant 470 if I want to look at these various services? What options must I post for? The E-rate second modernization order is very clear that if I want to explore one of these dark fiber options, whether it's me owning the fiber through self-provisioning or me leasing dark fiber from a service provider, I also I'm required by the order to look at fully managed lit service options from service providers. So USAC's kind of putting in a little bit of a check and balance. USAC's kind of putting in a check and balance and saying that you as the applicant, if you want to explore these dark fiber options, you also have to consider lit services, fully managed lit services, where the service provider owns the infrastructure, they give you the equipment, they provision the equipment, and they manage the technical support ongoing. It's kind of like USAC saying and the FCC saying in their guidance that, we trust that you know what you're doing, but we want you to have to do the comparison first. We want you to have to do the comparison first. So least lit fiber, and Mindy just gave you some of the nuances. The other issue is that USAC tweaks these definitions of service every year. Brian, don't laugh at me. I'm trying to be kind here. They tweak these definitions of service every year. So if I want to bid, the least lit fiber that I have up here is for a WAN circuit. So it's between 2 points on the WAN. It does not include internet. If I want to bid a WAN circuit with over fiber, all I have to do is bid least lit fiber. I don't need an RFP, and I can just bid that lit fiber service. Okay? If I want to bid only least dark fiber, okay, which is I'm not interested in going through a construction project, good Lord. I'm not interested in owning my own fiber. I'm not interested in having to do a contract for fiber maintenance to find somebody to repair a cut for me. I want somebody else to do that piece of it, the fiber maintenance. So I want to lease fiber, and I'm in a pretty fiber-rich area where I know there's a couple of service providers who might be willing to lease me dark fiber. If I just want to bid lease dark fiber, the only comparative element that I have to do, the only comparative service option I have to bid is least lit fiber. So I have to compare leasing dark fiber, leasing those strands of fiber to the service provider coming in and placing the equipment for me and provisioning the service. Okay? So again, least lit fiber, least dark fiber. And when I say compare, what's that look like? Okay? If I get bids for both options, I actually have to pick a period of time, let's say 5 to 10 years, or however, let's say I ask for 60-month bids for both least dark fiber and least lit fiber. I have to look at the costs of both of those, the cost of the least dark fiber and the cost of the least lit fiber. For least dark fiber, I also have to include the cost of the equipment, and the cost, usually maintenance on least dark fiber, is priced separately. In least lit fiber, the equipment and maintenance are bundled into that monthly recurring cost. So I have to compare the lease for the dark fiber, the equipment costs for lighting the dark fiber, and the maintenance costs for dark fiber to the monthly recurring cost I get for least lit fiber. And then over a 5 or a 10-year period, whatever I choose, I have to choose the most cost-effective solution. Okay? So for least dark fiber, if that's all I'm interested in is leasing dark strands from somebody else's, from a service provider or a third-party owned network, all I have to do for my comparison is bid least lit fiber. If I am bidding to build and operate my own network, which is self-provisioning, I have to bid something called services provided over third-party networks on the drop-down. Now, USAC's made this easy on the 470 this year in that if I choose self-provisioning, the option that I bid automatically includes services provided over a third-party network. So what the heck does services provided over a third-party network means? So services provided over a third-party network, in their definition, is any type of fully managed service over any type of infrastructure. So basically they're saying if I have to bid self-provisioning, I also have to compare it to any other type of fully managed service over any type of infrastructure. It can be coax, it can be wireless, it can be fiber, it can be others. All right? But that's my comparison. And basically I have to do the same thing. I have to take, now you won't have a monthly recurring cost for self-provisioning because it's construction. You're actually building the fiber and you're owning it. So you're going to have a big upfront capital cost. And then I'm going to have a maintenance contract and equipment. That maintenance contract might be a monthly recurring or an annual recurring cost. I got to bundle all those costs together and compare them to any of these fully managed service bids that I get. So you might be comparing, and I'm going to use, we're doing some work in the state of Nevada right now. There's a construction company, or I'm going to use North Carolina. There's a construction company called Utiliplex in North Carolina. I'm going to be comparing a Utiliplex construction bid for my WAN to potentially a Spectrum monthly recurring 10 gig service for a 10 gig WAN. And I'm going to be making those cost comparisons. So let's say the build between 5 locations is $2 million. That's the raw cost, and I'm an 80% district, so I'm responsible for $400,000 of that with my non-discount share. And you have a state match in Illinois, and we'll get into that in a minute. So I've got a $2 million build, and let's say it's 8 locations, and Spectrum comes back and they want to charge me $2,500 a month for those for each one of those 8 locations for a 10 gig service, 10 gig transport service. So you got to take the $2 million, and then 8 times 2,500 is $20,000 a month, so $240,000 a year. And you've got to start to make those comparisons. And let's say I choose 12 years of comparison. So I can assume that that Charter Spectrum cost stays at about $240,000 a year for those 8 locations, all the way over a 10-year period. So that would be $2.4 million in total costs over that 10-year period, as compared to the $2 million construction cost. However, I have to add in my equipment for those 8 locations. Let's say that's a couple $100,000. And then I have to add in annual maintenance, which say is probably $45,000 to $50,000, or not that much. It'll probably be $10,000 a year. You've got to add all those together and do a comparison chart, and then choose the most cost-effective solution. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. It's not complex, but there are so many details in it as you go through it, and so many questions that you have to prepare for program integrity assurance, that it becomes complex. Now, if I want to bid both self-provisioning and leased dark fiber, I've got to bid all 4 of those options. I've got to bid self-provision networks, services provided over third-party networks, leased dark fiber, and leased lit fiber. So I've got to look at all my comparisons. Because leased lit fiber is the comparison for leased dark fiber, and services provided over a third-party network is the comparison for self-provisioned networks. Okay?
If you just click the next, it should.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So let's talk about a couple of things before we go into that. You know, a lot of folks have bid this, and I'll get into it in a minute. But what happened was that when this was introduced, there were some aspects of the program that weren't exactly, the guidelines weren't exactly in enough detail for the applicant community to understand. And one of those details is very attractive for rural markets. And I don't know how many of you are from rural markets. I spend now about 90% of my time in rural places. And just an example, I mean, if my community is very fiber poor, if I'm in a fiber poor area, and services for business and residences and government agencies in that area aren't there, why build a network exclusively for the schools if I'm a service provider? There should be some way where if I'm a service provider, I get the opportunity to not just serve the schools when I bid on a school opportunity, whether it be leased lit fiber or leased dark fiber. I should be able to figure out a way, an efficient way to serve the entire market under the existing rules, particularly if I'm willing to pay for things myself for capacity that is beyond what the school needs. So USAC this year has really clarified the guidelines, but I'm going to take a step back. Any project, any fiber-based project can involve special construction. Special construction in USAC's definition is any build of new infrastructure, the design, the engineering, the construction costs, the project management costs, the materials costs, just the materials of that build, that's all special construction. Special construction can happen in a lit fiber service where the service provider owns the infrastructure and provides the equipment. If they have to build new fiber in order to reach your locations, that's special construction. It can happen in leased dark fiber. Again, if they have to build new fiber, that third-party owner, to reach your locations, that new fiber build, those incremental costs of new fiber build are special construction. And self-provisioning is all special construction. It's all new build of fiber. Nobody else can own that but the applicant. So applicants have been asking USAC for the 2 years of the program to kind of come out with clearer guidance on, if I'm a service provider and I'm going to own this fiber and it's a new build of fiber and I want to put extra strands in that fiber in order to serve the rest of the community, how do I cost allocate that? Is it a pro rata share of the fiber? Is it a incremental cost? How do you define incremental costs? So USAC this year has basically said it's incremental costs. So for lit services special construction and leased dark fiber special construction, if the service provider wishes to have extra strands in the build, the E-rate applicant must cost allocate all incremental costs from the special construction reimbursement request. In other words, if it's a $2 million build in my example, and the incremental costs of moving from 12 strands, which is what the applicant needs, to 96 strands is $200,000, the service provider can only bill special construction at $1.8 million to the applicant. They have to take those costs of the incremental out of the special construction costs that the applicant sees. And they have to provide detailed documentation as to how they arrived at that $200,000 number. Okay? So the applicant can never see that $200,000 on a bill, but they're going to need in PIA documentation that says, this is how I arrived at the $200,000. All right? Now let me show you. So this came from a white paper that Sika and I and a couple of others did to help clarify this. So what's a detail look like? And I know I'm scaring the crap out of the people that did want to bid dark fiber. And so what's that look like? Okay, so USAC will be looking for documentation that looks something like this from the service provider. Let's say I wanted to go with, my applicant need is for a 12-strand cable. I want to lease 12 strands. I want to put 2 as my production network, 2 to run my security cameras, 2 to do some other things, but I need this capacity of 12 strands. Or I'm only going to light 4 in the first year, but I'm willing to pay the difference between a 4 and a 12-strand cable in order to have the 12 strands. So the service provider has to really come up with, what's the difference between a 12-strand cable and if I want to put a 48-strand cable in? So in my example, I say it's 66 cents per foot. So they've got to cost out, the applicant cannot see the bill for that 66 cents a foot. It cannot be in the special construction request that the service provider makes of the applicant. For a larger cable, I started to make stuff up. For a larger cable, it shouldn't cost any more to design and engineer a 12-strand plant than a 48-strand plant, but I made it up and said, okay, there's a 30 cents difference. For project management, it's the same. For splice enclosures, you can only bill the applicant for the splice enclosures of the 12 strands. Anything over a 12-strand allocation for splice enclosures has to be on the service provider because it's a splice enclosure for the strands that the service provider is going to own and use to serve the community. A fiber patch panel. The applicant can only be charged for a 12-strand termination panel because that's all they're getting. For the other 36 strands, to buy a patch panel, the construction company or the service provider has to either buy a separate 36-strand patch panel and not charge the applicant, or cost allocate the difference. For conduit and other, let's say a larger conduit, again, unrealistic, but let's just say a larger conduit is required for the 48-strand cable. The difference between an 1.25 inches and an 1.5 inch conduit has to be allocated to the service provider. They have to cover that cost. And so that's a 40 cents difference. That's just an example. There's probably about a 15 to 20 item list that the service provider will have to cost allocate. But again, the applicant cannot see that bill. And the service provider has to provide documentation to show what they have covered in that construction cost.
So it's not listed in the total cost and then listed in the allocated out cost. It's like, here is your bill, but here's the additional stuff
Remember,
that we're
when you
doing.
file the 471, it's a formal request for reimbursement. So you can only ask for reimbursement on the special construction costs that are yours as the applicant.
Okay.
But you're going to have to put in your documentation with the 471. It's a $2 million build, of which we're charging $1.6 million to the applicant. And here is the $400,000 difference.
That is the
Here's what
difference
we've
that we're
allocated.
working.
You'll avoid 2 rounds of PIA if you do it that way.
Okay.
Honestly, you will. If you provide that level of I predict you will. I can't say with any certainty, but I predict you will.
And so, and I think he's going to touch on this. I don't want to say problem, but one of the stipulations of this funding is that it must be installed within the fiscal year you're asking for it.
Yeah.
So if you go through a PIA review and you spell it all out like he has said it up front, and the PIA review goes smoothly and you find out that you get that funding, let's be optimistic, in November or December, you have to ensure that your provider can install and do that build within those next 6 months before that June 30th mark. So the clearer that you can be upfront with your request, the better and more likely you are to get it installed within that fiscal year. Because if they can't do it within that fiscal year, then you turn around and have to do it all over again and apply all over again for the following fiscal year. There are no extensions.
What if they start the construction and they're unable to complete the construction within that year due to weather delays or?
That is a great question. What if they start that construction but can't complete?
So if you applied for that up front, if you have a large regional WAN project, and I'm working on 2 or 3 of them right now, if you have a large regional WAN project, USAC wants you to divide that project logically into yearly increments to build. Okay, that's the first answer to the question, is that when you look at it, you've got to take a realistic look at what you can get done then. You can tentatively, you can bid it all at once, but only apply for reimbursement for those entities that will be finished in a specific year. Now, if you face a situation where you filed the 471 and you filed the 471, and let's say you don't get a decision until December of that school year that you filed for, there's no way you're going to get the build done, or there's some act of God, a hurricane, weather, or whatever, you can file a Form 500 and get the money extended. But you have to have an extenuating circumstance in order to do that. So again, when you think about these projects, try to divide them. If it's a large project, and when I say large, okay, the most difficult part of this, is sometimes it's permitting, right? It's permitting from government. It's permitting from county government, state government to build along a highway, things like that. The permitting process, you can almost guarantee, will take 6 to 9 months. So what you want to do is potentially lay the groundwork for that early. Tell them that you know that the project's coming. But you want to realistically kind of look at these things and say, what can I get done in this funding year prior to June 30th, the end of the funding year, and port my circuits over from my existing service to the new dark fiber service. So again, if you have an extenuating circumstances, including delay in decision through PIA, you can use the Form 500 to extend. The better way to do it, though, is to kind of break this up logically and put in your mind that timeline of 6 to 9 months for permitting. If you're going across a railroad, it might be more. If you're going across or if you're going to touch on a Corps of Engineers, Army Corps of Engineers lake, it's going to take longer. If you're going through an area with snail darters, you're probably going to be, or the mother vine in North Carolina. It may take longer for environmental review. If you're going through historical property, state historic preservation that's been designated, it's going to take longer. So at least, if you're going to take the step to say, I want to self-provision, at least do some research on where you're headed with those potential routes, how to avoid maybe state historic preservation or the mother vine as we have in North Carolina. There's a vine apparently that runs all the way down the East Coast from Maine to Florida that we ran into as we were building. And it takes a while to get those permits done. So whether it's a service provider for leased dark fiber or leased lit fiber or self-provisioning, it takes a while to get those things done. So you want to think about that timeline and break the request for reimbursement up into logical places. The other thing that comes up a lot is that if you're dealing with several entities, let's say it's a consortium, and those different entities have different expirations on their current Category 1 contracts. Those contracts end over 3 years. So that's a decent way to think about breaking up the project. Bid it all in 1 year with all the members of the consortium, but only apply the 471 for the year,
this year.
that what you're going to finish this year, if that makes sense. Okay.
So the advantages of doing this and going down this route, and I appreciate all of Joe's insight, and if anybody is interested in researching and talking about that further, he'll be here through the end of the day today.
And I'm also, part of what I do with Brian and the technical team at ESH is that I look at RFPs and help them kind of manage through the process. So. And
they have, to start with, RFP templates and things that you can use to start putting your information in and really start looking at this option. But this gives an option for a lot of your communities in the room, and that we'll be checking this out online, who your district might have fiber connectivity now, but it's just your district, and you could really take a look at servicing the rest of the community back behind this build that you could get to you. And I know that's been a really big concern for a lot of our rural communities, so this is an option where the district can do something for the community as well as themselves.
I don't know if I had any more slides.
I don't think so, because this one's back to mine, but
okay.
There is a fiber presentation that was provided at USAC at the regional meetings. There were only 4 of them this year. Joe has given about as much insight as the presentation will give you. But you can go check that out and of course talk to Joe. And then please do cycle back with me, cycle back with Education Superhighway. They are free. They don't want any of your money. They just want your time, and they really do want to help you. So please do cycle back with them if this is something that you're interested in, because now is the time to do it. There is a lot of, this one might be yours too.
It is. It is.
There are some 470 requirements and what you have to keep track of in going through with this. I'll step to the side and let you talk to your own slide.
So I wanted to give you with one last slide, kind of when your project involves special construction. So whether it's leased lit fiber special construction, again, service provider owned and provisioned, but there's a special construction request tied to it, or leased dark fiber where the applicant leases the dark fiber, provides the equipment to provision the fiber, or self-provisioning. These are the kinds of things that, and Mindy, I assume you're going to talk about state match in a bit.
Yes.
So I'm not going to cover the details of the match, but you've all have worked hard in Illinois to come up with a match, which is great. But these are the things that they're going to look at, so be prepared in program integrity assurance and PIA. They're going to look at the Form 470 and the RFP. They're going to make sure they're compliant. So go back to the slide where the bid options. They're going to make sure those bid options were compliant. This year, they're looking at the RFPs more and more for leased dark fiber and for self-provisioning. They want to make sure that you define in the RFP every service option that you bid on the 470. So you've got to come up with a definition for services provided over third-party networks. You've got to come up with a definition for leased lit fiber, for self-provisioning, and for leased lit fiber in that RFP. And that's where the ESH templates can help, is we've written definitions for every one of those service options in the 470. The competitive bid review, be really careful with your correspondence with the vendors. A couple of things on this. Mindy mentioned earlier kind of your time frame. On these special construction projects, really important to keep in mind what she said. You have to have a 28-day window at some point in time in the bid process where you didn't have communication with the vendors. Now, on these projects, normally what happens is, those that can involve special construction, is that you'll issue your 470 and your RFP, and you'll have to have a walkthrough. You'll have to have a bid meeting, because these are technical. Folks need to look at building entries and things like that. Do you have existing conduit? You're going to get a ton of questions. What we've been doing this year is basically saying, okay, there's a cutoff date for questions. Let's say we issue the 470 and RFP today on December 11th. And on December 19th, we have a vendor walkthrough. What I've been saying is, okay, all vendors then have to have their questions in 3 days later, by December 22nd, and we will post answers to Epic by December 23rd. Getting to Christmas. Working on Christmas Eve.
Right in time for Christmas.
But then I don't have the RFP due date until 28 days after December 23rd, after I've posted those questions. And I've made it clear to the vendors in most of the cases that I'm involved in this year that I am not going to talk to you or respond to you between December 23rd and the due date. Just in case I have to make what USAC and review would consider a cardinal change. And a cardinal change could be anything. It could be that I had the building entry on one side of the building for one facility and I had to switch it to the other side. They'll consider that a cardinal change. So I want to make sure I have 28 days in between that last vendor communication, that Q&A, and answering and getting the RFP in. Just be really careful about that. I would say that is either the number one or number two reason why applicants didn't make it through the process successfully. Stick to your bid matrix. Believe it or not, I saw while I was helping with review, an applicant would put a really involved and cool bid matrix rubric in the RFP, and then they wouldn't follow it doing the evaluation. I know. Careful with correspondence. We're working with a district in Nevada, which basically, after the 28-day window and after they got bids in, the tech director went back to one of the providers and said, you're still a little high in your price. Others have submitted bids that are lower. Don't do that. Please, don't do that. Cost of construction. They're going to want to know details about the cost of construction, okay? What's reasonable, what's not reasonable in material, but they want to know as much about the build as possible. Did you have to go deeper than 3 feet deep if you're burying fiber because of something that happened? Put all that detail in, because the reviewers are getting really good at understanding costs. Excess strands. We just talked about excess strands for least lit fiber and least dark fiber. The service provider has to come up with those incremental costs and not bill the applicant for it. For self-provisioning, okay, there is no opportunity to put excess strands in and sell them off commercially. We don't want districts in the fiber business. We don't want them competing against private sector. That's been asked a ton of times. So that will get denied. If you are working with a government entity for public sector service, like to serve healthcare and things like that, you have to go through a similar process to what I showed you with least lit fiber to isolate those incremental costs of the government agency being involved. But you can do a self-provisioning project now in a consortium with a village government or with a city government. I would really recommend getting assistance if you're going to do that, though. It's complex. State match, there's a bandwidth standard for state match. The FCC adopted a bandwidth standard that looks a lot like the State Educational Technology Directors Association, the CETA standards. And they will hold you to that. If you ask for a state match, you're going to have to prove that you're meeting that bandwidth standard in order to get the E-rate money to match the state match.
And that's an amount per student, so you have to take the amount you're asking for divided by your students and ensure it's higher than that standard.
Yeah. And it's 1 meg per student right now for ISP connections, and it's 10 meg per student for WAN connections. And then they're going to look at the winning bid in detail. And all your correspondence. it's a very arduous process.
Yes.
By nature.
And so part of it is, a lot of you, I think, have the technical chops to go ahead and do a self-provision network and get that equipment and know what you're doing, or at least dark fiber solution, and that would really meet your needs. But there's also the other reminder here that you also have to have the paperwork chops to be able to get all the details and answer all of those questions. And so it may just be more than a one-person job. Back at your district, you might want to have a few people on board, somebody who can talk to your district legal, somebody who can understand the RFP process and all the paperwork and team it with you. And of course, reach out to our extra help and support, because it's not an easy road, but if you could get down the road yourself and do that, it could be a huge benefit to you.
You won't have to worry about it for 15 or 20 years.
You don't have to worry about it for years on end.